For example, you could publicly expose the situation by writing a letter to the community or showing evidence of how you are being treated. By doing so, you are not only defending your rights, but also revealing the abuse so that others can see it. Imagine that you have a contract with a service company that has decided to impose an unfair penalty on you. Maybe they are charging you an unexpected fee, or they are demanding something that was not clearly stipulated. You decide to face the situation, but instead of shouting or arguing, you do something more impactful. You decide to publicly show how they are treating you. You could send a message through your social media, or even communicate with a local media, explaining what is happening and how this company is taking advantage of its clients. You do it in a respectful but clear way, showing with documents how the company's policies are being unfair. This act not only exposes the problem, but also pressures the company to reconsider its behavior, since now its reputation is at stake. In this case, giving the cover does not mean that you allow abuse, but that you use the power of truth and transparency to expose injustice. Instead of responding with violence or revenge, you choose a strategy that reveals abuse and puts it in the public eye, forcing those responsible to face the consequences of their actions. The teaching of Jesus is not about losing everything. The teaching of Jesus is not about losing everything. Jesus did not ask for weakness or passivity. He was teaching us to face injustice in a way that would reveal its nature without falling into the same cycle of violence or abuse. Finally, what does the second mile mean? In the days of Jesus, the Roman occupation was not only oppressive, but also humiliating. According to the law, a Roman soldier had the right to force any civilian to carry his military equipment, which could weigh more than 30 kilos, but only for a mile. This was a way of imposing authority, reminding the civilians who were under the dominion of the empire. However, forcing someone to walk more than a mile was prohibited, and doing so could bring sanctions to the soldier. When Jesus says, if someone forces you to walk a mile, take 2, he is not asking his followers to accept oppression without more. Instead, he is proposing something much more strategic. Taking the team a second mile voluntarily not only breaks the pattern of abuse, but also generates 2 very significant effects. Primero, pon el soldado en problemas legales. Al caminar una milla adicional, el civil está obligando al soldado a enfrentarse a las consecuencias de sus propias acciones. Este gesto eleva la situación más allá de lo permitido, haciendo que el abusador tenga que cuestionarse. Vale la pena continuar con este abuso. Segundo, displaces the oppressor. The act of taking the team beyond what is required disconcerts the soldier, because it is an exaggerated obedience that breaks expectations. Instead of responding with resentment or resistance, the civilian acts in an unexpected way, leaving the oppressor without the control he was looking for. Imagine that you work in a restaurant and a client is being rude to you. Maybe he is demanding things from you in an unkind way, complaining without reason or trying to put you in an uncomfortable situation. The most common reaction could be to take care of him in a bad mood, or simply to do the least. However, you decide to act differently. Instead of limiting yourself to doing what he asks, you give him an exceptional service. For example, if he asks you for a glass of water in a bad way, you not only bring him the water, but also offer him an additional drink out of courtesy of the house. You do it with a kind and professional attitude. You have the control, not to submit, but to act with an excellence that I did not expect. Carrying the load 1 more mile, in this case, does not mean allowing them to abuse you, but showing that you have control of your response. By acting with kindness and professionalism, you expose the injustice of the behavior of the client, without having to resort to direct confrontation. It is a clear example of how exaggerated obedience breaks the dynamics of abuse. Jesus did not ask his followers to be submissive, but to act with an inner force that could transform the most complicated relationships and situations. The second mile is a strategy to show that you are not under the control of the oppressor, but that you choose to act from your dignity and character. Your second mile is not an act of submission, but a way of exposing the unfair dynamics with intelligence and dignity. It is a strategy to change the narrative without falling into the cycle of conflict or resentment. Jesus was not teaching weakness, but a radical form of resistance that defies the abuse of power without resorting to violence. Carrying the burden one more mile not only demonstrates control over the situation, but also takes away from the oppressor the power he seeks to impose. It's an act that says, "You can't control me, I choose how to react." The second mile is not about surrendering, but about using action as a tool to expose injustice and transform the relationship between the oppressor and the oppressor and the oppressed. Throughout history, humanity has used two main paths to face evil: the violence that seeks to destroy the aggressor, and passivity, which allows abuse to continue without resistance. Both paths have serious consequences. Violence perpetuates hatred and the cycle of aggression, while passivity leaves the victims without dignity or justice. Jesus, however, presented a third, radically different way: a la resistencia no violenta. Este enfoque no solo rechaza la violencia como respuesta, sino que propone formas creativas y transformadoras de confrontar la injusticia. Instead of attacking the oppressor or submitting to him, nonviolent resistance changes the dynamic of power, empowering the oppressed and disarming injustice. What does nonviolent resistance achieve? First, it morally empowers people. When you choose not to return evil to evil, you are taking control of the situation. You are not a passive victim or someone trapped in revenge. You are acting from a position of moral strength. Second, break the cycle of aggression and revenge. By refusing to perpetuate violence, you prevent the conflict from intensifying. Instead of responding with hatred, you choose a strategy that disarms the pattern of aggression. Third, return dignity to the oppressed. Nonviolent resistance is not submission. It is an act of courage that shows the oppressor that he cannot steal your value as a person. By acting with dignity, you remember that your identity is not defined by how others treat you. Fourth, a vergüenza al opresor y lo obliga a reflexionar. Nonviolent resistance creative strategies expose the injustice of the aggressor's actions. This not only highlights his cruelty, but also invites him to reconsider his actions. Fifth, use humor and creativity to ridicule brute force. An unexpected or even ingenious response can disarm aggression by exposing the absurdity of violence or abuse of power. The three examples that Jesus taught, the other cheek, the mantle, and the extra mile, were powerful forms of resistance in their context. Each one challenged culturally accepted practices, exposing their injustice. However, today, those specific practices no longer exist in the same way. Nobody forces us to walk a mile with military equipment, or to deliver our tunic in a trial. But the principle behind these teachings is still relevant. Jesus was not giving literal instructions. He was showing how we can use creativity, dignity, and courage to resist evil without falling into violence. His words are an invitation to find new ways to face the challenges of our time, adapting their teachings to our current realities. Here we present three modern examples of this. First, Denmark during the Nazi occupation. During the Second World War, the Nazis implemented an order in Denmark that forced the Jews to wear yellow bracelets with the Star of David, marking them for discrimination and persecution. However, the Danes did not remain cross-armed. In a gesture of radical solidarity, the Danish people, including the king himself, began to use the same bracelets. This act of non-violent resistance left without effect the intention of the Nazis to isolate the Jews. The collective and brave action of the population turned injustice into something absurd, forcing the Nazis to withdraw the order. It was a powerful example of how creative resistance can frustrate an oppressive system. Second, peasants in Brazil. In the 70s in Brazil, a group of peasants was demanding the return of lands that had been taken from them. Some of them were arrested during the protests. But instead of fearing, hundreds of other peasants went to court and offered to be arrested as well. This unexpected act overflowed the judicial system. The judge, faced with the impossibility of imprisoning everyone, had no choice but to release the prisoners. This type of non-violent resistance not only disarmed the system, but also demonstrated the unity and dignity of the peasants. Third, civil rights movement in the United States. In 1955, Rosa Parks, an Afro-American woman, refused to give up her seat to a white man on a bus, defying the racial segregation laws of the time. This simple but deeply courageous act inspired the boycott of public transportation in Montgomery. Led by Martin Luther King Jr. To learn more, visit www.akilu.org. The boycott, which lasted more than a year, led to the derogation of racial segregation on buses. It was a brilliant example of how a peaceful act, combined with an organized collective resistance, can topple entire systems of oppression. These historical examples show us that Jesus' teachings on nonviolent resistance are not just ancient words, but powerful tools to face today's injustices. In our daily lives, we can apply these principles in equally creative and effective ways. The greatest act of nonviolent resistance was when Jesus gave his life on the cross. In those times, the cross was the maximum symbol of humiliation and defeat. To die crucified was the cruelest form of punishment, reserved for the worst criminals. Para los Romanos, the cross showed that they had absolute control, and that anyone who defied his authority would end in the worst way. But Jesus took that symbol of shame and transformed it into a symbol of hope and freedom. What seemed to be the moment of greatest defeat became the greatest victory. Jesus did not fight, did not attack his enemies, nor did he try to save himself. The cross was the symbol of hope and freedom. Instead of that, he chose to surrender completely. With his sacrifice, he demonstrated that evil cannot be overcome with more evil, but with love and surrender. Jesus made it clear that he was not a passive victim. He himself said, "No one takes my life. I give it by my own will." With his death, he exposed the injustice of the system and showed that even the most oppressive and violent power does not have the last word. Jesus taught us that love, forgiveness, and sacrifice are much stronger than hate and violence. But this does not remain only on the cross. Jesus invites us to follow his example. He calls us to live in a way that reflects the image of God in everyone, starting with ourselves. This means understanding that we are all valuable, regardless of how others treat us. It also means respecting the dignity of those around us, even if they have hurt us. Instead of responding with hatred, respect the dignity of those around you. Jesus shows us how to find different and brave ways to face evil. When someone has hurt you, the easiest thing to do is to seek revenge or simply move away. But Jesus invites us to something different, to forgive, to treat with love, even those who have hurt us. It does not mean that you ignore the damage, but that you do not let that damage control your life. The cross teaches us that the true strength is not in destroying our enemies, but in transforming evil with good. Jesus, when he gave his life, showed us the way. His sacrifice was not a defeat. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share this content with those you think need it. God bless you. Amen. Jesus taught many incredible things, full of wisdom that changed lives. But he also said some things that are difficult to understand. Even today, there is a teaching of his that, when you hear it, seems confusing and even a little strange. Put the other cheek. It does not mean what you are thinking. Give the tunic to the one who asks you and walk the second mile. They don't want to say what you imagine either. These well-known phrases hide a deep message that has been misinterpreted for centuries. In fact, an erroneous understanding of these teachings has led to terrible consequences. Justification of abuses, acceptance of injustices, and loss of the true strength of the message of Jesus. Today, we are going to debunk the strangest and most enigmatic teaching of Jesus, the one that has confused so many. And that, when you understand it, I assure you that your way of seeing the world will change forever. But before we continue, let me ask you, have you blindly accepted these sentences without questioning them? Or are you ready to look beyond the words and find the true message? CSASE, write a comment saying, "I am ready to live the teachings of Jesus." Now, let us begin. On that occasion, Jesus was sitting on the slope of a mountain, surrounded by his disciples, and a crowd gathered to listen to him. Everything he said caught everyone's attention, but his words were not easy to assimilate. He had already said things that seemed completely contrary to what most people thought, such as that the poor were blessed, that it is good to be persecuted because of justice, and even that insulting someone was as serious as taking their life. But what came next surprised even more. With absolute calm, Jesus said, "Have you heard the law that says that punishment must be according to the severity of the damage? Eye for eye, and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist the one who is bad. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer him the other too. Whoever wants to sue you and take off your tunic, also give him your cape. And if someone forces you to carry his load a mile, take two. Matthew 5, 38-41 for the disciples. This must have sounded like something completely out of place. In the tradition of his people, the law was clear. Justice should be equivalent to the damage received. But here was Jesus, challenging that idea and proposing something that seemed absurd. Not only not seeking revenge, but even doing more than the aggressor expected. What could this mean? Jesus was not talking about a common and ordinary justice. He was presenting a new path. A radical concept on how to treat others, even those who hurt us or oppress us. The natural approach is to defend oneself, to pay with the same currency, and to protect oneself from any attack. But Jesus proposed something different, not to resist evil with more evil. Instead, he asked to respond with acts of kindness and generosity, breaking the cycle of violence and revenge that dominates this world so much. However, a doubt arose naturally. Did Jesus want people to become weak? Was he teaching that a good Christian should let others humiliate him? It is a teaching that to this day remains difficult to understand. But it is possible that Jesus was talking about a greater force than revenge, a way of demonstrating power through mercy and love. When we hear phrases like, "Do not resist the evil," it's easy to imagine that Jesus was teaching absolute submission. For example, you could think that if someone in your work constantly takes advantage of you, asking you for tasks that are not yours, you should simply accept them without complaining, because it is the right thing to do. This sounds like a call to passivity, right? Then there is the idea of putting the other cheek, and the idea of putting the other cheek. Many people see it as an invitation to tolerate any kind of abuse. Perhaps you had an argument with a friend or family member who insulted you or mistreated you, and you felt that you should not respond, because Jesus said that you should put the other cheek. In situations like these, it seems that Jesus asks us to be like a carpet, where others can trample us without consequences. Finally, there is the phrase to walk the second mile, which is often used to motivate us to make more effort than we should, even when the circumstances are unfair. For example, imagine that a classmate or workmate asks you to finish their part of the project, something that is clearly not your responsibility. Instead of setting limits, you might think that walking the second mile means doing more and more, regardless of whether you are exhausted or the other person is taking advantage of it. At first glance, these phrases may seem like a call to become defeated people, easy to manipulate or control. In the minds of many, being a good Christian implies letting others go over us without saying a word. But the real question is this what Jesus really meant? In other words, this type of interpretation of Jesus. Translators note, this is a translation from Spanish. Under the idea that this is what it means to follow Jesus, they have ended up being like a boxing bag, enduring what no one should endure. These erroneous interpretations have led to two tragic results. First, cowardice in the face of evil. Some have understood this teaching as a call to never resist. Instead of facing injustice, they have opted for passivity, allowing evil to continue advancing without control. Second, complicity with injustice. Others, by not acting, have allowed the oppressors to continue causing harm, becoming, without wanting to, part of the problem. Instead of defeating evil with good, it seems that evil has won completely. This leads us to a crucial question. Is this really what Jesus wanted to teach? Was he really saying that his followers should be defeated people, without voice or will? Or maybe we have been misinterpreting his words all this time? Do not worry, because right now we will see how these teachings do not have to do with weakness, but with a transformative force that can change your way of facing evil and injustice. The truth is that when Jesus spoke about offering the other cheek, he was not suggesting that we allow someone to hit us repeatedly. To understand this teaching, we need to look at the cultural context of the time. In the culture of the time of Jesus, a slap was not as much an act of physical aggression as a gesture of humiliation. Learn more at www.wjesusneverexisted.com. It was a way of showing contempt for someone, especially if the back of the right hand was used to hit the right cheek. This type of blow was commonly directed at subordinates or people considered inferior. It was not a violent attack, but a clear message. You are less than me. So, what does it mean when Jesus says, "You are less than me"? If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer them the other one. The answer is in the dynamic of the gesture. If the aggressor decides to accept the offer and hit the other cheek, he would have to use the fist. But hitting with the fist was not an act of humiliation. It was a blow that implied treating the other as an equal. The other option of the aggressor would be to stop by realizing that the act of humiliation did not have the desired effect. In both cases, the teaching of Jesus seeks a clear objective: disarm the aggressor, not with violence, but with dignity. Imagine that you are at work and your boss publicly scolds you, making you feel small in front of your colleagues. Offering the other cheek in this context does not mean allowing him to humiliate you more, but answering calmly and in self-control. For example, you could answer something like, "I understand your point, but I think we can talk about this in a more constructive and respectful way." This type of response not only prevents the situation from escalating, but also puts the other in an uncomfortable position in which he must reconsider his attitude. Imagine that you are in a family reunion, and a relative makes a sarcastic or hurtful comment about you in front of everyone. Maybe he insinuates something like, "You have always been the one who achieves the least in the family, right?" At that moment, you feel attacked, and your natural reaction could be to return the blow with another comment as hurtful, or, on the other hand, simply remain silent, feeling humiliated. Now, think about Jesus' teaching on offer the other cheek. Instead of returning the insult or allowing the comment to crush you, you can respond in a way that disarms your aggressor without losing your dignity. You could say something like, "Well, I think we all have different talents in the family. I am proud of what I have achieved." With this answer, you are not ignoring the attack or allowing the comment to define you. You are calmly affirming your value and making it clear that you will not fall into the game of humiliations. This puts the aggressor in a position in which he must reflect. Will he continue with the hurtful comments, risking to look bad in front of others? Or will he stop doing it when he realizes that he cannot control you with words? The point of offering the other cheek is not to allow others to continue attacking you, but to show them that their attempts to humiliate you have no power over you. It is a way of maintaining control over your response and showing that your dignity does not depend on how others treat you. This teaching is not about passivity, but about courage and inner strength. This teaching is not about passivity, but about courage and inner strength. It is a reminder that by responding with calm and respect, you can change the dynamics of a situation and often make the aggressor stop and reflect. The teaching of Jesus does not seek to turn us into passive victims, but into people capable of breaking the cycle of humiliation and violence, showing that our dignity cannot be taken away. Offering the other cheek is an act of internal strength, not of weakness. Now, what does it mean to give the cloak? In the time of Jesus, it was common for the poorest people to be judged by their priests. Often these people were forced to give their tunic, the basic garment they wore, as a guarantee of payment. Although Moses' law forbade taking this essential garment as a permanent garment, since it was necessary to protect oneself from the cold during the night, Exodus 22:26, this practice had become common. Instead of protecting the most vulnerable, the system stripped them of what little they had. In this context, Jesus proposes something that at first glance seems absurd. If someone demands and wants to take your tunic off, leave them your cape as well. But why? What sense does it make to give them your cape and be left with nothing? The key lies in the cultural impact of this act. In Jewish culture, nudity was something deeply shameful. But shame did not fall so much on the naked person, but on the person who saw or caused that situation. When the cloak was removed, the person not only was left without clothes, but exposed the cruelty of a system that had taken everything from him. The act of handing over the cloak is not a gesture of submission, but a form of powerful protest. Shabbat Shalom. When he is naked in front of the judge and the creditor, the debtor is not accepting his situation passively. He is exposing the injustice of a system that exposes the poor of their dignity. This gesture not only displaced the creditor, but also the judge who allowed such abuse. It was a way of saying, "This is what you want. Then let everyone see what you are doing to me." Jesus was not suggesting that his followers accept the abuse without resistance, but that they use an intelligent strategy to denounce the injustices and make them visible in a way that no one could ignore. Imagine that you are in a dispute with your landlord. Perhaps he has charged you extra fees or increased the rent without prior notice, knowing that you do not have many options. Instead of simply discussing or accepting the situation, you decide to do something that draws attention to the injustice.